Welcome. My name is Andrea Cass. I'm an associate planner at Upper Valley Lake Sunapee Regional Planning Commission, and I'm also a staff person for the Connecticut River Joint Commission. Just to go over a few housekeeping things, please keep your mic muted at all times. We're going to have a chance for questions and answers at the end of the session. So if you can, just put your thoughts, your comments, your questions into the chat, and then we'll have our presenters chat with you. And if you'd like to also put in the chat where you're from, who you're representing, if you're just an interested person in the region, feel free to put that in the chat so we can all get to know one another. And with that, I'll hand it over to Chris.
Great. Thank you so much, Andrea, and thanks to everybody for joining us. Welcome to the third forum in this four-part series on making room, planning for those who are here and those on their way to the Connecticut River Valley, hosted by the Connecticut River Joint Commissions in collaboration with Antioch University, New England, the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, the Upper Valley Adaptation Work Group, and the City of Keene. The Connecticut River Joint Commissions is composed of the New Hampshire Connecticut River Valley Resource Commission and the Vermont Connecticut River Watershed Advisory Commission. State statutes direct the commissions to cooperate with each other to preserve and protect the resources of the Connecticut River Valley and to guide its growth and development. My name is Chris Campany. I'm the Executive Director of the Wyndham Regional Commission in Southeast Vermont, and I chair the Vermont half of the CRJC. Jennifer Griffin, who's unable to be with us today, chairs the New Hampshire half and is chair of the CRJC as a whole. Our work is supported by the Upper Valley Lake Sunapee Regional Planning Commission, and I want to thank Olivia Izue for her work pulling this together, and her colleague Andrea Cass for helping facilitate this forum. The focus of this series is to reflect on the fact that the Upper Connecticut River Valley may be attractive to those who choose to move due to a number of factors related to climate change, including more extreme and frequent coastal storms, coastal flooding, and related sea level rise, scarcity of fresh water, and increasing wildland fire and related smoke. The terms climate migrant and climate migration can mean many things and represent people who move by choice and people who are forced to move by circumstance, including disaster. And I'll note that climate migrants may not necessarily recognize themselves as such. Climate-related concerns may be a factor in deciding whether to move and when and where to move, but it may be a factor among factors. But many publications have identified northern New England as having a more habitable climate relative to many regions of the nation in the near future, and anecdotal evidence indicates people moving to the region now may be factoring climate into their decision. So how do we make room for those who are already here as well as those who are coming? In this third part of the series, we will look at infrastructure that is necessary to make room and factoring in climate adaptation and resilience so as not to put people in harm's way or diminish our natural resources and habitat. We'll also look at programs and funding opportunities in New Hampshire and Vermont for local communities to do planning and implement projects, along with examples of how communities are making use of these opportunities. And my throat has gotten dry, sorry about that. I want to welcome and thank Lauren Oates with the Vermont Nature Conservancy, Ethan Widrick with the New Hampshire Department of Environmental Services, and Bonnie Waninger with the Vermont League of Cities and Towns for agreeing to be our discussants for this forum. I'll let each of the speakers introduce themselves. Lauren will set the context as to why climate adaptation and resilience must be taken into account as we think about community infrastructure needs to make room. Ethan will discuss New Hampshire programs and the need to identify and address natural disaster and climate-related vulnerabilities in community programs. And Bonnie will discuss federal and Vermont state opportunities to link community project needs with funding and strategic thinking. So thanks everybody for joining us. Lauren, take it away.
Thank you, Chris, and the team for putting us on. I'm really excited to be here today. I'm going to share my screen and get a head nod from somebody who is on video to make sure that you are seeing a presentation and just the presentation view. Yes, thank you, Bonnie. You listened. All right, so I only have a few slides. I try not to use as many words in the slides, so it might be a bit anecdotal. And I'm excited to hear the other presenters and the questions that you all have for us. So Chris gave me a quick intro. Hi, everyone. My name is Lauren Oates. I'm the Director of Policy and Government Relations with the Nature Conservancy in Vermont. Some of my other credentials that are probably useful for this group, and knowing where I came before I was at TNC, where I'm primarily focused on land use related policy solutions for climate change as it's here, that creates more resilient natural and human communities. Prior to joining TNC, I worked for the state of Vermont as the state hazard mitigation officer, working on state-based hazard mitigation, which is really just climate adaptation and resilience plans, as well as working with local communities on their local plans, which we'll get to in a little bit, as well as grants that would improve individual and town-wide resilience to primarily flooding here. And we'll get a bit to the climate trends too in a moment. I also sit on the Vermont Climate Council. I guess I was going to say with Chris, but Chris has since ended his tenure there. I have a little bit more time. So I sit on the Climate Council as the member who represents expertise in natural hazard planning and resilience. So that's very relevant to this group here today. And actually, I came to Vermont before joining the state to help the town of Waterbury, kind of in north central Vermont, recover from Tropical Storm Irene, and did a really significant long-term resilience plan with that town, and I'm going to talk a little bit about how that plan really paved the way for a robust comeback by that community following a really devastating flood. And before I change slides, I'm a little reticent to admit this, but this background photo is actually a photo of the Cockermouth River in New Hampshire. So sorry to my Vermont friends on the call, but I use this photo all the time and never admit that it's in New Hampshire. So I figured I'd let you all know it's not technically in the Connecticut River watershed, but it's a really stunning photo. So that is New Hampshire. Next slide. I wanted to set context because I was listening to a podcast that I think immediately shared with Chris and a couple of my other colleagues. It's just the New York Times, the daily podcast. And so I'm expecting, because it's widely listened to, that some of you might have even heard this episode, but there was an episode a few weeks ago around the Colorado River and the 7 states out in the Southwest and far West that depend on that water for drinking water, recreation, and more, and how those states have not worked collaboratively to figure out a significant allotment plan for how much water they can use in a sustainable way, especially given the pervasiveness of drought that's happening out in the Southwest, and how that's intended to, or how that is going to worsen with climate change. And so they're all in this significant and like deeply concerning predicament where they're running out of water and they can't come to an agreement on how much each can use. And I think it just is, it's a really interesting story. I recommend listening to it. It's actually really terrifying about the nexus of poor planning, especially across geopolitical borders, and the climate reality that we're all facing and that we know is coming. It brings up the questions, where will these people go when there is no more water, and the impacts that might have, because the Northeast is expected to get more water, and what role does planning play at the local, regional, and statewide level, and multi-statewide level in climate adaptation and resilience, especially in the face of climate change and climate-forced migration. So, and to set the ground a bit, I wanted to talk a little bit about the climate trends that we're experiencing in Vermont and New Hampshire. These graphs, you don't really need to like squint your eyes to see the trend here. This is from the 2021 Vermont Climate Assessment, but unfortunately for those of you in New Hampshire, the climate models aren't looking much better for you. We are both going to be getting significantly warmer and significantly wetter. That's what the top graph is, just the change in warmer winter days over the decades from 1900 until now. And the graph below is the same time frame, but the observed annual precipitation increase. since 1970 in Vermont, actually since 1990, excuse me, we've received 7.5 inches of increased rainfall annually. And that is not in like nice drizzly days where the ground has time to soak it up. It's unfortunately coming in more extreme high precipitation events. So we're not giving our ground time to absorb those waters. They're coming heavy and fast at us. And then as our state climatologist on this side of the river, Dr. Leslie Ann Dupigny-Giroux likes to say, you know, climate change in the Northeast is a hydrological problem. She tries to remind us, because we typically capture it as flooding. She's like, we've got a water problem. Actually, it's in between those instances of high precipitation that are going to cause significant flooding, especially in our villages in northern New England that are populated very near, and often on top of our rivers. We're also going to experience increased drought. And we've already seen those trends coming too. So how you plan for that and how you make sure that we're using our water thoughtfully, how we are creating infrastructure to support community build out that also uses water thoughtfully. I'm hoping that Ethan can speak a little bit to the infrastructure part of land use planning in a bit, and how that plays a role in climate adaptation and resilience is incredibly important. There are other trends that are climate related that will have impacts too, you know, pervasiveness of invasive species, which actually can get like its tendrils into a lot of land use implications too. And how we need to make sure that we're creating space for natural habitat to move, as nature needs space too, and humans rely heavily on biodiversity for our own survivability. And so we're in a biodiversity crisis that has significant implications, and it's compounded by the issues of climate change. And I'm happy to talk a bit more about that if there's interest later. So those are the trends, and I spoke a little bit about the impacts, but I want to just acknowledge that climate change isn't just a meteorological issue. It is going to impact like pretty much, if not all, sectors of our lives, of our economies, of our social framework and networks and beyond. And as there is anticipated to be mass migration around the country, around the world, how we plan for building resilient communities, making sure that we're creating space for habitat, and doing that all in a way that understands, grid-based resilience for energy demand alongside changes in our weather patterns is going to be very, very important. So we know the physical damages associated, flooding, drought, these things that, higher wind, we're going to have more windier days, both in Vermont and New Hampshire, and the damages that those cause largely to our electrical infrastructure. And as we have a greenhouse gas emission problem, our electrical infrastructure is going to have to be built out too. So there's a huge push for making sure that that component of our collective societal infrastructure is robust and safe, as well as increased opportunities for heavy ice related events as our winters are going to warm and there's going to be more ice related disasters in the future. Aside from those apparent physical damages that we experience in northern New England, there's also the community cohesion and social cohesion impact of climate change. And there have been a lot of social studies that have gone around how close your social network is, whether it's, you have a really close-knit village within a community, you have a very close-knit town-to-town relationship, or you just have like a small, your cul-de-sac in your neighborhood is like really, really close, has significant impact on your ability to recover from, respond to, and largely grow your resilience to these hazards. This is especially true for heat-related issues, and we know that we're going to have more extreme heat in the future and more prolonged days of heat, which is actually the bigger issue than those more extreme heat days. The bottom left image here is a picture from actually early COVID days, food drop for those people who could not access food. And we had a significant problem. I believe New Hampshire did as well, as most states did in the beginning early days of the pandemic, making sure that people had access to those things like clean water and food. And it really stressed our social network and our social infrastructure, and identified a lot of real vulnerability that we have in our food security, which is also, again, going to be impacted by climate change and the climate trends that we're going to experience over here. Town capacity and turnover, I'll talk a little bit more about that in a moment, but highlighting that for our small towns in Vermont and New Hampshire, most of whom will carry the brunt of planning, grant applications, making sure that they have, emergency management, emergency response to all of these issues. There's a significant burden that falls on these small towns that often have 3 to 5 member volunteer select boards. A town clerk who's like the most heroic person in northern New England that just has to manage and know everything. And just a couple of community members who are willing to spend more time helping their town and their neighbors. And that's really fragile. That's really fragile infrastructure that social infrastructure that we've relied really heavily on. And that is going to continue to be stressed. In the absence of county government, obviously, we have significant support from and resources in our regional planning commissions and our regional planning associations. I don't know if New Hampshire uses RPA or RPC, but hopefully I'm capturing the inclusive term for our regional planners, who are effectively our county government in the absence of it. They're the ones that have greater capacity and yet still not enough support from our respective states to do what is asked of them for our communities and for us as individuals. That's also exacerbated by the lack of, I should acknowledge the turnover word there. All of that stress leads to significant turnover in our towns and also in our RPCs. And with that, we lose a significant amount of historical knowledge. You had to bring somebody new on who might not know about where to find the right plan, or who knows actually about that spot in town that seems to be a little more vulnerable to flooding. Those are the historical knowledge is in states that don't have state land use plans, and states that don't have really strong state or county government. That is a significant vulnerability that we're going to face, and causes problems when we figure out, when we're creating a new town plan, where do we want to more densely develop that is safe? Where do we want to put our infrastructure that makes sense? There's that capacity and turnover will continue to prove problematic well into the future, as again will the lack of a state land use plan, which then leads us to the onus being heavily on our towns and regional planning commission support framework. For the grants and planning piece of this, the next slide will talk more about plans. So I'll focus in on grants. And sorry to keep referencing you, Chris, but you've used in the Climate Council framework a lot the phrase Hunger Games to describe how municipal granting for both state and federal funds, how it really plays out in Vermont. And I'm assuming it's very similar in New Hampshire. Those towns that have more people, therefore a larger tax base, who have more, are able to pay for greater town capacity, professional planners, they actually have way greater opportunity to find and apply for these grants. They have more opportunity then to create more resilient communities. And oftentimes they're competing against towns that have, the one person who's the road foreman who also happens to know that he has time on a Friday to work on a grant. And it's proving to be deeply inequitable, which leads to broader statewide, but also community resilience concerns when we think about long-term and short-term planning. Chris, I see you came off mute. Do you want to jump in?
No, just inelegantly saying 5 minutes, but no, you're doing great.
No, it's fine. I only have one more slide. I'll finish early.
No. And I totally agree with everything you're saying. Sorry. We've got to figure out a better way for the 5-minute warning.
Well, I can see you if you just want to go like 3 next time.
For anybody who didn't participate in the first one, we went way over. Yeah,
I told you I'd be done early. I'm hoping I'm still there.
But keep on.
And then so just my final slide here. As you all know, whether it's like your short trip to the grocery store, plans you have for the weekend, and anything as trivial as that to as important as long-term community planning, there are so many externalities that we face. We have climate models, so we kind of know what's coming, but we don't really know what's going to come until it gets here. We know that people are probably going to start moving in greater numbers into the Northeast, and yet still, when you look at census data, a lot of people are still moving south, which is surprising given the meteorological issues that they'll experience. And so the questions that are on here, they're intentionally all squeezed together because it's kind of meant to represent the chaos that is everything that we have to grapple with, and how we plan for community resilience and adaptation, how we make sure that those places that we're building are safe for future climate models, that we're not building to what standards we know today, but that we're building in flooding related concerns like higher or more appropriately, but that we're keeping our communities compact, that we're not just spreading out high up and significantly dispersed, because that will create all sorts of issues like infrastructure issues, like biodiversity and abundance collapse issues. Really, that social cohesion gets lost when you don't have compact settlement too. It's just really the problems with not building tight communities are pervasive, and they'll worsen with climate change too. So looking at building and infrastructure, making sure that we're identifying those places that can absorb floodwaters, but also retain water when we need it for drought-related instances. Looking at the capacity issue, how can we make our towns more resilient? That turnover question that we're asking, where do our town plans and regional plans play into all of this? How do we draw from all of the plans that are expected of our towns, which are really significant, to make sure that they're informing where and how we create community in the future? Things like the local hazard mitigation plans that I talked about earlier, regional and sometimes local energy plans. A lot of towns in both of our states have like energy committees and conservation committees, and making sure that the knowledge that they're bringing to the table gets heard during town planning efforts, and that experiential knowledge that gets held with people who have been in community for so long is also heard. How do we balance that last question, the long-term issues with the problems of today? We have things like inflation and really unaffordable healthcare. I'm not going to get into politics because it's a nightmare in this country right now, but all of these pressures that we're experiencing that require us, especially those of us who are more financially and socially vulnerable, to have to manage. It makes that ability, that capacity for long-term planning to try to create a future for ourselves and for the next generations that hopefully will be less problematic, really hard. And so I just want to acknowledge that the weight of all of that is really palpable, and it makes this work really hard. So I guess I'll close with excitement to hear what Ethan and Bonnie are going to share, and just a request that as you all go out into your respective communities, to make sure that you're thanking your town personnel and staff, as well as your regional planners who have just like done a lot with a little. And I am going to close there. I think I came under time, Chris.
You did perfect. Thank you, Lauren. And really appreciate your leadership within the state of Vermont around these discussions on these issues, and within the the Climate Council. One thing I'll just note related to the municipal capacity, and I don't know about New Hampshire, but there's been a lot of discussion, both from the governor and the legislature among all parties, about the challenges of especially rural community capacity to access funding. And Bonnie will get into this, and Ethan, I suspect, will too. I think, and I'm not trying to, well, I guess I am trying to be provocative, but not in a negative way. I think it's an honest question we need to ask, both at this, at the legislative level and executive level. I think we really need to engage with towns to just ask honestly the question, towns, do you feel like you have the capacity to do this kind of planning that's necessary? And just be real honest about it. So that way we have all these tiny units of government, most of which have no experience doing this level of planning and trying to develop these kinds of big infrastructure projects at all. And yet we're expecting them to learn how to do it and do it really fast. And I think it's a fair question to ask them, how do you feel about this? But what we've done is we set up the expectation that they can do it and they will do it. And then I think there's been some surprise that, well, they're struggling with it, but we really shouldn't be surprised. We should be asking, how do you feel about this? Do you feel like this is something you can do? Thank you so much, Laura. Ethan, turning it over to you. Thank you so much for joining us.
Okay, can everybody see my slides?
Yes, sir.
Perfect. Good afternoon, everybody. I'm Ethan Widrick. I'm the Resilience and Adaptation Manager at New Hampshire DES for both the Wastewater Engineering Bureau and the Drinking Water and Groundwater Bureau. And from that, you can probably guess, I'm going to talk about infrastructure and how it's the foundation of community resilience under the topic of today, which is making room. There we go. So topics for today, just really quickly, I'm going to go through the criticality of infrastructure as a whole. I might be a little bit biased there. We'll see. Might be a soapbox opportunity. Some existing funding resources as well as recommended strategies and target areas. Although probably the bigger point I want to harp on, I have some key takeaways there, and I want to convey this as kind of the paths for addressing climate migration. So number one being work with and support your local utilities, pass on some general knowledge of available resources, and then being creative with those existing resources. And don't worry, I'll cover these at least 15 more times, so don't feel like you got to memorize them now. So really quick, soapbox number one. Oh, there we go. Really quick, soapbox number one. Like I mentioned, I may be a little bit biased, but infrastructure as a whole, it just has a heightened level of criticality. It is even historically the foundation of a community. And by that, I mean, if you look historically, some of the settlements that became towns, became cities, they were founded around a water resource. They didn't, just settle in the middle of nowhere without having that underlying resource for everybody to utilize. So that's kind of the foundation of where they started. And that continues today. So if you look at commercial and residential development, businesses or developers aren't going to come to an area that does not have adequate infrastructure. It just wouldn't make logical business sense. So a parallel to kind of the settlement mentality early on, but a little bit different. And you can kind of see that now going forward with some of the climate migration concerns. One of the core drivers for people moving away from, typically areas out west are lack of water resources, moving to places like the Northeast that may be a little bit more abundant in the resource. And then of course, also with emergency events, the infrastructure that's available, and here I'm going to talk about water and wastewater specifically, it is the core to resilience and the endurance of a community. And it can actually be a key indicator of the timeline for return to normalcy after an event as well. Also, just being completely open and honest, not trying to make fun of anybody. They're needed for survival. Literally, water is needed for survival, right? And in today's society, we've advanced enough to have water and wastewater services within our home, most times. And most people, the way that we are now, if those were to go out, we would not survive that long without access to clean drinking water. And by that, I mean if you had to go out and obtain it yourself. Water resources as they sit now weren't or are no longer like they were once upon a time, kind of how I mentioned in the historical aspect of, you know, having clean drinking water readily available, you know, take it straight out of the river, straight out of the lake, etc. So why do I talk about all this, kind of pulling it all together? I want you to remember to prioritize infrastructure when we're talking about community resilience as a whole and climate adaptation as we go forward. Okay, soapbox number 2, but this is my first foot stomping moment, and that's why it has the number 1 on the top. Support your local community. And what I mean by this is I'll touch on some of the funding avenues on the next slide, but really you as an individual, as a homeowner, you're not going to go out and try to get funding for a whole infrastructure system, right? You're going to rely on your utility, your municipality, to be the subject matter experts in order to put in those funding applications or grants. So get to know your utilities, understand their situation. I think that's the best thing you can do, both as an individual, but also maybe as town administration, other agencies, etc. One thing that's kind of been a point of order already is the lack of funding, lack of staffing across the board. And one key component for utilities is they operate 24/7, 365. It's not a glamorous career field by any means, but the folks that get involved with this, they care about the public. They're there to support the public, support the community, and we should support them as best we can in the other direction. Historically understaffed and underfunded, like we talked about already, and then they have a lot on their plate. If you look at the diagram on the right, that was from the American Water Works Association 2022 State of the Water Industry. These are the top 20 concerns facing utilities. Each one of those is a major topic. I won't bore you by going through all of them, but you can imagine that each one has even sub-bullets that require a lot of time and effort. And like Lauren mentioned, a lot of town staff, there may be 2 or 3 people, and the same thing goes for utilities, that have to handle all of those items. It's a huge burden. So just kind of keep that in the back of your mind when we're talking about infrastructure as well. All of this, it kind of leads into the next bullet, which is enable your local utilities to improve existing infrastructure. Because infrastructure is already incredibly expensive, but needed, like I mentioned on the last slide, they need our support as community members. So whatever respective town that you live in, show the support to the utility to help prioritize some of those projects that maybe got pushed off for decades or sometimes longer. And one of the key things to think about too, just food for thought, is infrastructure, at least for water and wastewater, both literally and figuratively, is out of sight, out of mind. So it's easy to forget how important they are. So don't kind of push that to the back burner, but make sure that you're putting it in the forefront of your mind so it gets proper attention, proper priority going forward. And then of course, something that everybody can do, be a local advocate. Advocate for additional staffing, the projects that are needed, and then some things that you can just kind of spread word about. Water conservation, responsible usage for both systems, water and wastewater. One thing that's really important to note too, this is not by any means, I'm not picking on New England, New Hampshire, and Vermont. It's not a local issue. This is nationwide. There's a staffing and funding problem all the way across the whole industry, infrastructure-wise. And just as an example, I have in the second bullet there, estimated national water infrastructure needs through 2050. And I believe this was done about 10 years ago at this point, was over 1.7 trillion. And that's just for water, not even wastewater. So just kind of provide a frame of reference there. Okay, so really quickly, I know everybody's gonna really care about this slide. I'm gonna tell you right off the bat, this is probably the least important slide throughout my presentation, and I'll tell you why. And I already alluded to it a little bit. The point of working with your utilities, you know, they have priorities and objectives in mind for their infrastructure. They've been dealing with it. They know what needs to be done. And the more important factor there is working with them to accomplish it. Also, for certain topics, say like climate migration, we do not have a direct funding stream, but in the next couple of slides, I'll tell you how to get a little bit creative and incorporate some of those needs into our existing funding programs. But really quickly, there's a lot on this slide. I'm not going to touch on it all. The takeaway here, you can see on the left in the diagram, drinking water funding. This actually came from a funding workshop we did last week, and you can see there's a lot of money available. Unfortunately, we don't have enough money because the needs far exceed what we actually get. But within recent years, with the federal funding that's coming down, we're more robust than we've been ever, I believe. And then on the clean water side, wastewater and stormwater, very similar programs. So it's through the state revolving fund. If folks aren't familiar with that, it's typically a low interest loan program, but there are grant programs and principal forgiveness programs within that that are more specific to individual needs. And just some example common programs under there. I have a couple outlined: asset management and vulnerability assessments. I'll touch on those in a little bit, but just to name a few, there's planning efforts, energy audits, energy audit measure implementation, and cybersecurity. Okay, so getting started, number 3, this is the planning efforts, and this is where I'm going to get into kind of how you can incorporate topics like climate migration into some of the already existing programs, as well as hopefully some of the initiatives utilities are already taking on. So I have highlighted at the top there. I know this is a shared thought across the board, but it always is worth saying. Unfortunately, it typically takes an event to spark significant change, but don't wait for that. And that's where I want to really harp on the planning component of it. Anything you can plan for today, hopefully it eliminates or mitigates down the line. So I have it outlined in 3 kind of bullets there: base level, mid-level, and ultimate. Base level, really quick, just general planning for events and emergencies. This can be as involved as you want it to be. And it really depends on staffing, right? So if you only have a couple of folks, get together and talk about, self-identified issues, lay the problems on the table, maybe previous occurrences, and plan for those. At least you have a plan for the events that you've experienced already. It's better than nothing. And then if you do have additional staff, additional resources, you kind of tailor it to your own program, then plan further. Moving on to the mid-level, vulnerability assessment, which is kind of near and dear to my heart because it's a core component of what I do. It's an in-depth dive in your horizontal and vertical assets. And again, I'm talking infrastructure here. And looking at existing hazards, maybe potential hazards that you didn't know about, and future climate projection vulnerabilities, and coming up with solutions and recommended planning horizons for those hazards as they relate to infrastructure. So it's very all-encompassing from that perspective.
Hey, Ethan, just real quick, 5 minutes. Sorry. This is so indelicate. I hate this. Sorry.
So really quick on the ultimate goal, Lauren mentioned this as well. So I included this just to harp on the point that there's a lot of planning efforts out there. There's even some that are required. Just as an example, hazard mitigation plans, requirement through FEMA, right? My point here is to integrate them all as much as possible, as much as they can talk to each other, talk apples to apples, share data, whether that's input data and hopefully output data. It just provides additional justification. So whatever type of grant you're going for, whatever type of funding stream you're looking at, different agencies care about different things and care about different plans. But if they're all talking to each other, you're set up for anything, or at least the best that you can be. And then underneath asset management programs, I also included incorporating risk tolerance levels and CIP forecasting and planning. That's the ultimate level. That's where we hope to get to, because just blatantly honest, there's not enough funding to cover everything. In an ideal world, we would have that. That would be awesome. But if you're able to plan well and plan enough in advance, you get to a point where you can prioritize your priorities, because they're all kind of priorities, but that gets into accepting risk at certain levels. So if certain aspects are less risky, maybe you can hold that off for a little bit, but something's much more on the forefront, much more higher risk level, you may want to, plan for that in a 5 or 10 year horizon. Okay, so this is my last slide. This is the recommended strategies for being creative as far as climate migration goes. So I've mentioned asset management program already, and some of the key components are listed above. So just to kind of give you a frame of reference, it helps set the framework for your whole infrastructure program by identifying assets, whether that's characteristics, condition, location, etc. And then it gets into the program planning piece, and you can do a deeper dive into kind of the strategy of levels of service for your community, criticality, like I mentioned, risk tolerance, life cycle funding, etc. And the funding piece goes into the CIP component as well. But really why I'm telling you this, and again, I mentioned it, but it's the framework of the foundation for infrastructure planning. When you have this in place, you are pretty well set as far as planning for the future. Anything beyond that is just icing on the cake. Jumping into climate vulnerability assessment. So I kind of touched on this already on what it entails, but it's a look at all natural hazards and climate related concerns as it relates to your infrastructure. So it's kind of a supplement to what would be an asset management program. And then hint, include climate migration if that's the topic that you're concerned about. If you're looking at doing a vulnerability assessment, your consultant that you hire, ensure that you're bringing that up as a main concern. And then they can look at, maybe there is some input data to incorporate some future projections there and altering design and solutions going forward for your infrastructure, which many times might be capacity, right? Which I'll get into in the second component. So I touched on the state revolving fund. Traditionally, that addresses aging infrastructure. So that's where I'm getting at here, is kind of utilizing that existing avenue to go down and then tacking on some additional requirements that might relate to climate migration. But I do want to caution, look at it from a systems perspective. So if existing assets are in poor condition, new infrastructure adds little to no benefit. And what I mean about that is make sure your core system is up to current condition. Don't forget about your treatment plants, your pump stations, your 100-year-old piping, right? Make sure your core infrastructure is taken care of before you might add a nice shiny new system on the outskirts of the system as a whole. And then, like I mentioned, incorporating future capacity requirements and corresponding infrastructure needs. So that's where it gets into the climate migration component. So if there is a projected population increase and you're already doing a project to repair, upgrade infrastructure, integrate those specific design components into that, which then might be, we need to upgrade our treatment plant, or we may need to increase pipe size here, so that you're not going back in 10 years after the population increase is hit and then retroactively basically doing a whole nother project. So it's a long-term strategy and you're accounting for future needs there. The overall goal, hopefully, and I know this is easier said than done, but it's being less reactive and more proactive. So really quick, one more time, key takeaways: work with and support your local utilities. That's probably my number one, and it's literally my number one here. And then just some general knowledge of available resources. I know I skimmed over that, but if anybody has any questions, feel free to reach out to me. I can't promise you that I know all the answers, but I can get you in touch with the people that do. And then be creative with existing resources. So some of those more specific topics like climate migration, utilize those existing avenues that you can go down rather than trying to recreate the wheel. So you can at least take care of some of that low-hanging fruit and some of those easier objectives early on. Thank you. And with that, I think we'll turn it over to Bonnie.
Ethan, thank you so much. And I think this is an excellent lead into Bonnie. And I really, really appreciate you bringing up integrating, having plans work with one another, integrating those plans together. And I know one of the challenges that towns face is just actually implementing the plans they develop in the first place. So thank you for bringing that up. Bonnie, it's great to see you. Bonnie Waninger with Vermont League of Cities and Towns will now present. And I'll just say it was great to be back with her. She was the Director of Central Vermont Regional Commission, and it's great to be working with her in her capacity now at VLCT, the role that they're playing in really providing municipalities with a high-level view of all the different programs that are available and how to kind of stack those or think strategically about them has been fantastic and really helpful to the RPCs in the town. So thank you, Bonnie, and glad to have you.
My pleasure, Chris. And so Chris kind of did an introduction for me. Thank you, Chris. I'm Bonnie Waninger with the Vermont League of Cities and Towns, and I'm the coordinator of the Federal Funding Assistance Program. And this program is one that helps municipalities. It provides some expertise to municipalities and helps support them as they advance their own priorities. And what we do is try and help those municipalities move one more step towards seeing, realizing what they're looking to do. And I am going to flip on a screen now and do some sharing here. So hang on one second. Are you seeing a pot of gold, Chris? Okay, thanks, Ethan.
Yes, ma'am, yes.
All right, let me move some of this off of there. All right. So climate migration. Oh, sorry, I thought I turned that off. There are billions of dollars available right now, and that is billions, not millions of dollars, through a variety of funding sources. And my apologies to those of you in New Hampshire. Ethan gave you a heads up that kind of works for Vermont too on infrastructure. You'll see Vermont trickled through my presentation. I'm not quite sure how New Hampshire is handling some of this money, but I'm betting in many ways it's similar. So the types of funding that's out there, the American Rescue Plan Act, ARPA, as many people know it, provided money to states and to local government. And everybody's figuring out how to spend that money now. Some folks have spent all of theirs, and others are still working their way through priority setting. The Bipartisan Infrastructure Law, which some people know as the Infrastructure and Investment Jobs Act, they are the same thing. It started as bill, and now it's IIJA in the world of acronyms, but a lot of us still talk about the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law. For Vermont, that meant more than $2 billion coming through the state. For a variety of programs, the Inflation Reduction Act, that was $500 billion nationally. That included significant climate investments that'll impact municipalities. And then sometimes we forget there were always programs out there, and a lot of those programs received additional funding. Some of them did not, but they're still there, and we can still access them to further our climate migration, our climate resilience goals. But right now is a watershed moment. So I'm going to turn the slide. You're going to see the next few slides are going to talk about the Federal Funding Assistance Program. I'm not going to read all this text. This is for when they ship you the slides. But just know that our program was launched last year. There are two people, myself and Katie Buckley, whom some of you may know. And it's available to all Vermont towns, cities, and villages, regardless of their size or capacity, as well as other VLCT members. And it's funded by a 2-year grant from the state of Vermont through the Agency of Commerce. And this program is primarily because we heard municipalities say we lack capacity and we have difficulty writing grants, we have difficulty administrating grants and doing our project development, and we have no idea where the money is. So this program in part helps them find that money. One of the things we did was take the 500 Infrastructure Law and Inflation Reduction Act programs. There's a federal guidebook. We culled that down to just the programs that are open to municipalities. So municipalities are eligible applicants, but also they're applicable based on the scale of scope and projects undertaken in Vermont. So every time we asked ourselves, can we think of a Vermont project that might actually match with this grant? And if we could, we left it in the guidebook. So now we have the Vermont guidebook. It is on our website. And it changes as new programs come along or open We update it periodically to provide updates on those programs. So there are still some new federal programs that are just a title and a description now. They haven't been released and there's no information about them except the goal of what they hope to achieve. Our website also has 2 other things that anyone can access, which is open grant opportunities. What's open right now? And there are 30, 40, 50 grants open or funding. I shouldn't say they're all grants. Some are loans, some are tax credits, but they're things you can access right now. And then we also have upcoming grant opportunities. So looking out 6 months so you can plan ahead. What is it that should be opening in the next quarter, in the quarter after that, through December, so that you can start thinking about your project and how you might stack your funding. And I went the wrong way. Alrighty. Definitely went the wrong way. Sorry, I was not the animation. I thought I turned it off. All right, so this is our new website. Many of you have gotten multiple emails about the new website and the new municipal portal, which means that some of our information is only available at VLCT to members and other is public. So everything related to federal funding assistance is public. Any state, anybody can go in there and you can look at those open grants. They're not just, some are Vermont grants, but they're the federal grants as well. We have information about specific topics. And again, Katie and I are new to this. We're 6 months into the program. So you'll find that more and more content gets added each time. We know that local projects can be hard and we can help you make them easier. Not easy, but easier. And part of that is our consult on call service, which is essentially you book an appointment. You can access it through a link, find a time that works for you. It'll have already screened our calendars out. And you can book this appointment to talk about your project, your idea. You can ask about funding. And we basically have a Q&A with you that results in us providing you in writing afterwards. The very minimum people come to us for is, I need funding. What'll work for my project? And we call through those and we say, for the project you've described, here is the 1, the 0, or the 10 grants and funding opportunities that are most likely to fund it. And I will tell you the hardest thing to fund with outside funding is a town highway garage. Even though it's eligible in some places, it's not worth the time to go after the grant for your town highway garage because your return on investment will be so low. I just had USDA tell me yesterday, you can tell people to come to us for town highway garages, they're eligible, but we tell them they should fund it with their own money because the amount of grant funds versus loan funds they'll get, the project cost goes up 10 or more % to access that money. You can probably make that up by not accessing it. You might not have the grant funds, but you will save yourself that 10% extra. So consults on call, a lot of times those evolve into, but we've got this other problem with our project, or we need some direction on something. So we have those conversations. So you can just book in there. Oh my, that one I haven't seen before. Okay, sometimes a simple piece of information can make all the difference. We also do a weekly tip of the week that just talks about grant writing, grant administration, project management, and resources that are out there. Okay, I'm going to go faster. Positioning for grants. Observations. Vermont municipalities are too small and are advantaged rather than disadvantaged compared to other parts of the country. There are fewer but larger grants being awarded. So the Department of Energy is awarding 5 to 12 grants nationwide for all the energy efficiency money. I'm going to jump to the advice piece, which is you have to work together. If you're going to access the nationally competitive money, you have to work together. Municipalities working together as a consortium, regional commissions working with municipalities, or even in many cases, only a statewide application. And that can be organized by regional commissions, municipalities, or the state of Vermont. You have to prioritize needs, and pre-planning is essential. Sometimes your own money is your best option, like those town garages, and you need to build those funding stacks, which complicates your projects. And then for the tax incentives, you really need to engage professionals when you talk about those, because municipalities aren't used to accessing taxes. Okay, so like a skeleton, projects are composed of their parts. I was going to tell you about 3 projects, but I will just briefly lose this here. Jeffersonville Cambridge Flood Resilience Project is more than a flood resilience project. It's a hazard mitigation project, yes. It's also a transportation project, a conservation project, and a recreation project. And it all started with a plan. It started with a local hazard mitigation plan, identifying a flooding problem. You had 2 rivers, you had state highway infrastructure, and this whole section of town likes to flood, and it's getting worse. So they came up with multiple projects they could do, worked over a series of years, mapped out multiple funding sources, and have a great effort going for that project. But it started with a plan. For the Chateauguay No Town Conservation Partnership, it started with relationships. You had multiple towns working together. You see, this is a map. Here's 1, 2, 3, 4 towns. Here's Killington. There's a ski resort there. And they had this great area of natural resources where along the roads, slowly the forest was getting encroached on. In their case, it started with relationships. They turned those relationships into partnerships with the resort, with the communities, and then they evolved into money. And in East Calais, where the general store closed, it started with community. Their general store was closing. They were afraid they would lose their identity as a village. So they worked together. In that case, it was an enthusiastic group of locals who put together a plan, got community buy-in, and with that buy-in, accessed enough funding to turn that store into not only a store, which should open this summer again, but also units of housing and other things that serve their community need. So when you think of climate migration and climate resilience, it's the physical infrastructure that Ethan talked about, but it's also the social and the natural infrastructure you're working with. So where's the money? Briefly, the bipartisan infrastructure law has money for water, wastewater, transportation, some energy. It's got livability money, environmental programs, cybersecurity. The majority of the money a small state like Vermont and our rural communities are going to access is mostly the money to existing programs. More money to the Agency of Natural Resources for water and wastewater and stormwater. More money to the Agency of Transportation. There are a few national programs we can work together on to access. But so far, of the 0.9 billion Vermont has accessed, 80% has been transportation related because we have projects ready to go. And it was money to existing programs. Keep that in mind. Projects are ready to go. Your planning needs to be together. Your community engagement needs to be together. On the Inflation Reduction Act, it is energy, energy, energy. It is building that energy economy and trying to change our energy profile. There are some environmental conservation type programs in there. The vast majority of that money is really research and development funds for businesses, institutions, and utilities to assist in transitioning to a clean energy economy. And transitioning utilities, especially small municipal utilities, is one of the key things we need to help happen. For municipalities, some of the key things it did was open tax incentives. And it will bring, so we're not used to, as a municipality, you don't pay taxes. You've never paid attention to that. But there are tax incentives you can access for energy efficient buildings, for EV infrastructure, for purchasing your vehicles, and there's funding for things like diesel emissions and reducing your diesel emissions. So think about those when you think about those purchases in your budgets. It'll also bring funding to forest conservation and forestry assistance program. In Vermont, the urban and community forestry program is going to have more money than it's ever had before. They're framing up their projects. And also to conservation assistance programs like USDA's Natural Resource Conservation Service and other ones focused on greenhouse gas emissions. So the reason I talk about both these things is that projects never start with the money. That's where we usually start. People say, where's the money? If I don't know where the money is, I can't start a project. So folks usually come to the federal funding assistance program in their early stages of just starting a project, and they basically want some security there that there might be money out there that they could access. And then they have to dive into, more often than not, what we send them home with other than that money is you need to engage a community in these conversations before you're going to be able to access that money. One town came to us, they have this awesome project, a former school, they'd like to make it a town office, a community center, all of the great things. They're enthusiastic and they need to know where the money is. They thought that's what would convince their community. And then they went to town meeting and they weren't asking for anything and their entire town budget got voted down because the town residents already thought it was too expensive. They came back and they said, we need to start over again because they'll never do this. They'll never do more if they can't fund what they're at. And one of the things we talked to folks about, and Ethan hit on this with water and wastewater, which is many of our communities think about conserving costs as they, town budget. I don't want to spend that much money. The other part of that equation is how do you grow your grand list? And you're never going to grow that grand list without the investment in water and wastewater infrastructure that allows that development in your center to happen. It allows that small business to come in. It allows more housing, which brings people to the general store. Those are the kinds of pieces that help move it forward. When you talk about these, there are a lot of programs out there. We're happy to help people access them. I didn't highlight any specific ones because there really are nearly 500 programs. So Chris, I hope that met what you want, and that's it. This is who I am. I'm happy to talk with any of you. You can go right onto our website and book an appointment, or you can just contact me directly and we'll have that kind of conversation as well.
Perfect.
So
Thank you.
Whoops. I have to figure out, there we go.
Thank you so much. And I just want to reiterate something that Bonnie said, which is that in my latest newsletter article, whatever that's worth, I really stress that the towns that have successfully gotten funding like through the Vermont state ARPA programs, particularly I'm thinking wastewater, these towns had done the work like for years in advance. By the time the notice of funding availability or an RFP comes out, if that's when your town's starting to think about applying for it, you're probably too late. And in my experience, a number of towns, it can take years for a town to decide just to have a discussion about something, much less pull together a grant application and everything that's required. So one of the things I would encourage everyone to do is, even if you think you might miss the ARPA train, start doing those work, have those conversations now, because if you don't, it's always going to be too late. And something else that Bonnie noted is, none of this stuff is going to get any cheaper as time goes on. So, and and probably the availability of this level of funding, we may not see again in a lot of our own lifetimes. So, do the work now so that you're ready for whatever programs come along. Well, thank you all so much. Feel free, folks, to put your questions in the chat, and we can also answer hands that get raised, and Andrea can help me with that. There's one in the chat that I'm seeing right now. I think it's the only one so far. It's a question for Ethan. How should small towns located along rivers but without municipal water think about resiliency? At what point does it make sense to invest in a municipal water supply? Is this even feasible for small towns where every household relies on wells, about 700 people?
That is a great question. Honestly, it's a community specific solution, and that's what's always tough with utilities. So I can't give you an answer that's gonna, solve every problem across the board. But it would be worth, if it's feasible, to do some sort of analysis, kind of like I talked about the vulnerability assessment, but maybe at a smaller scale. If that's the one concern about converting over to or getting off of a well system and going to a municipal supply, that could be something that you bring on, just help with a consultant to provide some professional expertise to really do a deep dive and look at your system individually. I know that doesn't answer your specific response, but that's really kind of gets into that planning and individual look at your system perspective.
I see Marie Caduto has her hand up, maybe a response.
I might have a response. Certainly, it's a great question, and as soon as I saw that, I wanted to respond. As a watershed planner for the state, I see this all the time, and I get asked this question really frequently. You know, and I live in a town of 660 people, and one of the things that Vermont offers is what's called a planning advance grant, and towns can take advantage of that free, basically, to do a feasibility study for water supply and wastewater. So my town is going through that right now. We've hired a consultant with grant funding to have them look at the town, the village, what would make sense for a tiny little town like this. And they'll make some recommendations, and hopefully the town can go forward. Because I know, as Bonnie wrapped up, your comment was perfect, that this is a conversation not about how much is this going to cost me. It's about whether or not we want our village to grow, and we want some economic development in our town. And we have that opportunity, with new residents looking for places to be. As was said earlier, their businesses aren't going to come if you can't supply them with wastewater. Nobody can develop in my town because there is no wastewater. You can't have a cafe. We barely have a store, and if we don't offer that, we're not going to get that economic development at all. And houses in the village are even having trouble selling because they don't have anywhere for a replacement septic system, and they're tiny little lots right on a river. So it's a real conundrum, but I just want to make the recommendation that this is money that's available for your village to do those kind of studies. And there's money available if you foresee growth and you'll need water supply to make that happen. There is funding for preserving land where there is water supply. You don't have to tap into it now, but it can be there in reserve for future use as water supply. So there are some great funding sources that will help communities make the connection between what they have now and what they're going to need in the future. So.
Before we get to the next question in the chat, I just want to ask, one of the things that we need to keep in mind is in the existing villages without community water or wastewater, you do have shadowing of septic and well systems. And I think in Vermont, there might be grants available from the Department of Health to test well water to see what's in it. And particularly, right, you're looking for, it may be bacterial, you may be looking for bad bugs in the water coming from septic systems or other sources, but also things like nutrients at a unhealthy level. So Maria, do you know, is that correct? And Ethan, do you know if that's correct in New Hampshire? Because sometimes we lose sight of just like the existing health concerns without even thinking about, development concerns.
Yeah, it is. And again, that's another problem, because small, tiny village lots often have a well system and a septic system that are in very close proximity, and cross-contamination of the well from those surrounding septic systems can be a really big issue. So yeah, the health department can help with that.
And Ethan, go ahead.
Absolutely. I was just going to basically echo the same points. I'm not sure where the question asker was coming from, Vermont or New Hampshire, but I just wanted to put it out there that New Hampshire does have very similar programs, both on the testing side and the planning component of it as well.
Great.
Small systems.
And then Tom Sexton asks, are no flush treatment options in the mix on a large scale? And I'm imagining Tom's talking about composting toilets, urine diversion, those kinds of systems.
And go ahead, Ethan.
No, honestly, my initial thought, I don't really have one.
They're certainly growing here. An organization called Rich Earth Institute is really working on that, and it's a growing business basically in the region, turning that into fertilizer. And that's another thing, you know, when you're talking about wastewater on a small village scale, there are options beyond a wastewater treatment plant as we generally think about it. There are other ways to treat it, large community septic systems, spray fields, things like that. So there are alternatives that are significantly cheaper than your big wastewater treatment facility with pools and stuff. So I think that that's another thing that those kind of feasibility studies can really inform you on, and taking advantage of that, find out what's the most logical and reasonable solution for a village.
That's a good point, because what we're really talking about, especially in some of these smaller villages, are distributed soil-based systems. So it may be like on one side of a road, maybe everybody keeps their individual septic and well, but it's managed as a community system. On the other side of the road, maybe everybody has their own septic tanks, but then you have a shared gray water system. And then somewhere else, it may be everything goes to like a large septic tank and then a shared gray water system. And so the idea is use soils, and then what on the regenerative systems where you actually reincorporate nutrients into the environment, especially into the soils, and make use of those nutrients as opposed to pumping them out of a wastewater system into surface waters. That's that's a preferred alternative. Let's see, just one in the chat. Abigail Shepard asks, hi, any thoughts on Act 250 making it easier or harder to develop a more climate resilient infrastructure? Larnos mentioned earlier that we need to make sure that the experiential knowledge from people in communities gets heard. Do y'all have any options about the role of the public is able to play in development right now? Are there any policies besides Act 250 in particular in place make it easier or harder for development to be implemented in a way that prioritizes affordable housing or could allow for affordable housing to be more prioritized? I know it's a pretty big can of worms, so if I need to ask more narrow question, I definitely can. Thank you.
Well, there are a number of revisions to Act 250 before the Vermont legislature right now, and some of that compact development is part of that. And how do we make it so that that is a more reasonable process to go through? I can't speak to all the details in that legislation, but I know that is before it in conversation right now. And there's a hand up as well, Chris.
Yeah, well, Lauren, since your name was invoked, do you want to add anything? You want to?
Well, I have a like an internal professional rule to like always just like wince and avoid conversations around Act 250. That said, as far as the part about the experiential knowledge being heard and how the public's able to play a role in development, I'd say twofold. One is your planning commissions are actually really important in your towns. They are looking at both like short-term and long-term opportunities for where development should be located, lot size minimums, et cetera, and how that impacts both, the infrastructure, wastewater, sewer, et cetera, as well as just the climate vulnerability and where we're actually locating our communities. I would definitely recommend checking out when your next plan is due and who's on the commission and making sure that you're aware of those. And the other is it's probably like a little bit more state-based, is that at least in Vermont, I know New Hampshire State House is like a whole different world because you guys have a lot of members over there, like the most in the country, maybe. I don't know. It's crazy, like more than California. At least over 400. It's like 450. It's just wild. Okay. Well, in Vermont, it's much smaller. And And because of that, and maybe it's the same on the other side of the river, reaching out to your legislators is actually very easy. And not that many people actually do it, so they are typically pretty responsive. And so Marie mentioned there's a bill in front of the legislature now, like check it out, ask your representative or senator about like what it is, what's their take on it, and just kind of staying in the know that way is, you'd be surprised, I think, in Vermont how far constituent voice can go in the State House.
And two other quick things. I'll just say in the absence of, and Bonnie kind of made this point too, I think, and I think all of us have, in the absence of community water and wastewater, we will never have affordable housing at scale. We will never come close to having affordable housing that we need for the people here now. And you will not be able to achieve the compact settlements that virtually every regional plan and town plan calls for. And second, another thing just to keep in mind about Act 250 are what I call the 1 in 10 acre loopholes, which is a 10-acre town, which is when Act 250 gets triggered by a town with zoning, you can develop up to 9 lots without going before Act 250. You just have to follow the town zoning. And if towns have a lot of 2-acre zoning, which is really common, not knocking it, it exists. You can chew up a farm really fast with just the permits allowed under zoning. For 1-acre towns, these are for towns without zoning. You can subdivide up to 5 lots without triggering Act 250. You can take a 300-acre farm, subdivide it into 5 lots, wait 5 years, subdivide it to another 5 lots. You can chew up farm and forest land really fast that way. But right now that is the path of least resistance. And so rural sprawl is our default. So part of my concern about Act 250 is it is great that we're having pretty robust conversations around it, but I think we keep missing these loopholes. I don't know the ideal solution to that, especially in Vermont's really dispersed planning system, but it's just something to be aware of, one of our facts. Jesse, you had your hand up.
Thanks. I appreciate everyone's points brought forward. One thing I think that may not be underscored enough for people that are thinking on a municipal level right now are what disaster protections are available for the climate conditions that are going to occur here in conjunction with people moving up here. To me, that includes hazard mitigation plans, ensuring that are floodplain regulations for your town, and the overall sentiment of zoning and regulation. And for Chris's comments on Act 250, municipalities have those powers within their pocket, and I really encourage town bases to get those protections for disasters, because you can't think about growth and climate resilience if you don't have those protections in place. And if you have that growth coming to you without that in place and a flood event happens, your disaster outcomes are going to be much larger than any progress you could hope to make in anything. And then the last thing I'd underscore that a lot of people already have is, take the time, do the work to do feasibility studies to see where growth can be had, if at all possible. And that is very specific to water, wastewater, and housing. Thank you.
And Vermont Commissioner Steve Lemke has his hand up.
Yeah, thank you. So all the speakers and all the good questions. I'm a member of the CRJC, and since we started talking about climate migration, I've always sort of had the same question. Maybe this is for Bonnie. Bonnie, do you think most of the towns that would think about climate migration think about it as an opportunity or a threat? The reason I ask that is that it makes a big difference how you approach something. If you think, uh-oh, this is going to happen to us and we need to do something about it, or you say, we've got a great chance right now, a great opportunity to take advantage of this for our tax base and other things. So where do people think that really is lying right now as far as opportunity versus threat?
I would guess more of a threat, because most of us move to a community or live in a community because we like the community as it is. And so if you think about more people moving in, especially a lot of more people moving in, kind of wonder how that will change what you already like about that community. And so it feels a little threatening. So are we welcoming those folks? Are we helping them find their place and get to know what's special about the community they moved to, in addition to why they liked it? Or are we treating them like outsiders who we don't really want in our communities? So when you think of climate migration, it is the physical, the infrastructure, it's the, I'll call it the conservation, protecting those natural systems that are going to absorb water and release it. But it's also the social and how we're going to integrate folks into our community. People are perhaps reactive to climate migration, but I'm not really sure it's reactive in the way we hope.
And
I agree.
Lauren had mentioned in her comments about, people are still moving south. And one of the reasons why people are moving is our housing availability is almost nothing right now. And if you can afford to, you will leave. That's just a basic fact. If you can't, there are a number of Vermonters and New Hampshireites, who are probably living in substandard situations, and frankly, like let's say it's a domestic abuse or other situation, probably dangerous situations. And then of course, the worst case of all is homelessness. And so we've kicked this can down the road for decades now, and we find ourselves where we are. And so it's time to deal with it. And, frankly, what I find, and this is not unique to Vermont or New Hampshire, I've heard this in a lot of other places, but I've heard the very same people who may be opposed to housing because they don't know who will move in there, find themselves 10 years later not with a place that they can't live as they become like a senior citizen. They can't find appropriate housing for that stage in their life, or it's time for their child to find a home, or maybe their child wants to move back and they can't find housing. And so sometimes I think, we don't really think about the real impacts of kind of a response to any change that you feel may threaten the status quo. So it really is something we need to be really deliberate about. Marie, you had your hand up, and Rick, can Rick go first, Marie, since he hadn't asked a question yet? You're muted, Rick.
Okay. I was waiting to see if I could go first. I just read in our local paper that high-speed internet is supposed to be throughout Grafton County by the end of the year. That with that availability, it's going to make the area even more attractive and I think will exacerbate the climate migration problem and be, I think, more immediate. It's going to allow a lot of people to move up here to work from here, and will obviously exacerbate the lack of local housing. And also when a lot of folks, when they tend to move to an area, they want to bring other types of infrastructure into the area that they didn't realize that they were going to miss when they moved up here. So I think that's going to be it's going to make the area even more inviting, I think. So just another layer to be thinking about.
Thank you. I'm going to ask Andrea, could you take over host responsibilities? Because I have a meeting with the Vermont Secretary of State, actually, I need to get over to. But just I just want to say thank you so much to our our speakers today, Lauren, Ethan, and Bonnie. Thank you so much, and thanks for everybody attending. And we can continue this conversation as long as folk are able. Andrea, do you mind taking over?
Yeah, we have 4 more minutes, so why don't we hand it over to Marie to close this out. And thanks, Chris, for moderating today.
Thanks. I just wanted to go back to and second what Jesse was saying about zoning regulations. I feel like that's where we have to start first, because if we don't look at what's going on in our own towns and how we're managing where things are going and where they're not going, and whether or not you can take those lots and rebuild a septic system on them when there's no room for it. I think though, you know, that's your most local control on what goes forward. And I want to recommend that in Vermont, if you know, we're talking about flood resiliency as well, we have something called the Emergency Relief Assistance Fund. And if your town has those zoning regulations in place at specific levels that protect the floodplain, they protect the river corridor, then in the next flood event, you will get reimbursed at a higher rate than without it. So your town can save a lot of money, because what it does is incentivize you to protect those floodplain areas permanently, so that they don't get mangled and have to be fixed in the next flood. So it's weighing those, you know, those financial costs. In the long run, it will cost the state less if you don't build something there. So we incentivize that by providing the town with a higher payment for protecting those regions. So if anybody wants information on that, you can find it on Flood Ready Vermont.
Thanks, Marie. I think that pretty much brings us to 4 o'clock. Thank you so much to all of our speakers. This was such an awesome conversation. I just so enjoyed listening to all of you and all of the great questions that were in the chat.